Hello and welcome back. I'm Jimmy Knott, and we're in the midst of a series on the important subject of leadership. Frankly, by the time we get done, we'll have more than 5 hours of teaching on leadership, specifically on being a leader worth following. I want to take you back just for a few moments to review, and so there's going to be a connectedness from lesson to lesson to lesson. And way back in one of our earlier sessions, we looked at Mark chapter 3, verse 14. And for me, that really gives us a definition from the perspective of Jesus of what leadership is and what leadership does. Mark writes these words, "And Jesus appointed 12, that they might be with him, and that he might send them out to preach." Jesus was someone, that would be the leader, who appointed, that would be influence. The 12, the apostles, they would be the people, they would be the followers. And to be with him and to send them out, that would be to achieve a purpose. If you were to ask me, what is the definition of a leader or what is leadership? I don't think it could be any more simple than this. A leader is a person who influences people to achieve some purpose. It's about influence. And for you and me as Christians, we would want that influence obviously to be positive and not to be negative, to add value to the lives of people and to the lives of any organization in which we're involved. Gaining influence, gaining the right kind of influence is really what makes you and me someone, a leader, worth following. So how do you go about gaining that right kind of influence? Are there some specific qualities, characteristics, or marks of someone who positions themselves to be a leader that people want to follow? And I believe that there is. As you've heard me say before, Psalm 78:72 is my life leadership verse, where Asaph says of David, "And David shepherded them with integrity of heart. With skillful hands he led them." What positioned David to lead them? What made David, in spite of his imperfections, and by the way ours, what made David followable? Why was he a leader worth following? He had integrity of heart. That's character. That's who you are. That's the core. That's the fundamental component in being someone worth following. We spent 2 sessions on authentic character. And then secondly, with skillful hands. This is what you can do. This is your capacity to get results. And that being basically based on what you're good at, what you enjoy doing, and developing those talents and abilities and resources that God has entrusted to you and me, and moving them toward greatness, toward exceptionalism. So leadership worth following is about authentic character. We spent 2 sessions on that. It's about exceptional competency. We spent really 2 sessions on that, our last 2 sessions. And today we move into that third and final core component that makes us credible and worth following leadership, and that is what I call relational connection. And it's in the opening part of that verse in Psalm 78:72 where it says, "And David shepherded them." That's all about building relationships. Granted, for David at that point in time, it was the sheep, but it's all about building meaningful connections with the people that we're privileged to come in contact with. I want to begin this session 8 study, part 1 on relational connections. I want to begin it with a statement. Think about this statement. Relationships define who we are and what we do. Relationships define who we are and what we do, whether that's good, mediocre, average, or even bad. All of us, each of us, is a product of our relationships. I mean, you can go all the way back to the Garden of Eden when God said it was not good for Adam to be alone, and out of his side he made a woman and created relationship. Created relationships horizontally. The vertical one had already been established between Adam and God. Relationships have been a part of God's plan from the very beginning. I really believe that so much about life and leadership is all about building meaningful relationships and connections with people. Recently, I came across some information from a gentleman by the name of Cabot Robert. Zig Ziglar, frankly, had quoted him, and I found this to be fascinating information. Listen, 15% of the reason people get a job keep that job and move ahead in that job is determined by their technical skill and knowledge, regardless of their profession. That would be their competency, you might say. So, but what about the other 85%? Cavett quotes Stanford Research Institute, Harvard University, and the Carnegie Foundation as having proved that 85% of the reason people get a job, keep a job, and move ahead in that job has to do with their people skills and people knowledge. That's fascinating information. You know, the hard skills are important. That's your talents, your abilities, your competencies, and they're extremely important. And oftentimes it's those hard skills and our competency that get us in the door. But it's the soft skills of being able to build meaningful relationships, being a likable person that really in the end may define what success looks like for you and for me in what we do with our lives. So relationships define who we are and what we do. You recall when Jesus was asked in His ministry, what is the greatest commandment? What is the greatest commandment? And Jesus answered that in Matthew 22, it's also in Mark and also in Luke. In Matthew 22, verse 37 through 39, and Jesus said to him, you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind. This is the great and foremost commandment. The second is like it. You shall love your neighbor as yourself. On these two commandments depend the whole law and the prophets. What's Jesus saying in the passage? I mean, what is our faith ultimately all about? I'm not saying that theology or doctrine are not important. They are important. But I wonder in this statement when Jesus is asked, what is the greatest commandment? And His response is basically twofold. To love the Lord your God with everything that you are and have, and to love others, to love people, to love your neighbor as yourself. He's saying basically that our faith, the core of our Christian faith, is built upon two relationships. A vertical relationship with God, and then a horizontal relationship with others. As I said, life and leadership is ultimately all about relationships. And when Asaph describes David as someone who shepherded them, now obviously it was his observation of David as he dealt with those sheep, those stinking, hard to get along with at times sheep. Sounds kind of like people, doesn't it? But think of all of the functions and responsibilities that would go in building a relationship with the sheep. You know, David had to know them. He had to care for them. They were all just like people. They were all unique in a sense. He had to provide for them. He had to protect them. He had to set boundaries for them. He had to hold them accountable. All of those are things that you and I need to perform in building meaningful relationships with others. We have got to do what Asaph, if we want to be a leader worth following, we have got to do what Asaph observed about David and his relationship with the sheep, and I think later on when he served as king, and that is build meaningful relationships, deep connections with people. And in so doing, they will trust us and love us and allow them, as it were, into their lives. I mean, if we want people to willingly follow us, we've got to be able to build deep-hearted and deep-seated connections with them. Remember that Mark 3:14 passage? And He appointed 12. He appointed 12 to be with Him. And then He sent them out to preach. The relationship with Him was a central part of what Jesus commissioned them to do, to be with Him. And I will tell you, you can see that common denominator on and on and on when you look through the Scripture of the with Him relationships. I mean, you can go back to Moses, and you can go back to his relationship with Joshua. You can go back to Jesus in his relationship with the apostles. You can go back to Paul in his relationship with Timothy. You can go back in the Old Testament to Elisha in his relationship with Elijah, and then Barnabas in his relationship with Paul. And if you follow the narratives in all of those relationships, invariably you're going to find that phrase, with Him. Building meaningful relationships opened the door, gave entree to have impact and to make a difference in the lives of others. I think you could put it this way. Improved relationships equals increased influence. You know, if I were to draw a graph, and across the bottom part of the graph were strength of relationships, and on the vertical axis was greater influence. I mean, it would be proportional. As you and I built a stronger relationship with someone, we would have greater influence in their lives, in building meaningful relationships. And I think when David shepherded them, I really do think we're talking here more than just kind of a casual and superficial relationship. We're probably talking more than just communication. We're talking about deep-seated, genuine, and transparent connection if we're going to be the kind of person that people willingly want to listen to and to follow. So, having said all that, then it raises this question. What does it take to build meaningful connections, deeper relationships in our lives, so people will open up their lives, allow us into their lives, so we can speak into their lives and add value to their lives? Well, is it innate? I mean, the ability to build meaningful relationships, is that something we're born with? I mean, it's just kind of a personality that God has blessed us with. All of us know people that we would refer to as, well, he or she, they're such a people person. You know, I believe that's certainly true of a lot of people. They're just born with certain personalities and makeup that make them a little bit more likable, as it were, and relatable to people. And that's true of a lot of people. But here's what I know. No matter where we are on our capacity to connect with people, all of us can improve. All of us can get better. To be honest with you, when I look at these three components that create someone as credible and to make them worth following, whether it's authentic character or exceptional competency or relational connection, honestly, this last component is the greatest struggle for me of all three of the components, this relationship component. But I know that it's important. I know that people ultimately will follow and listen and learn and grow and give me the opportunity to add value into their lives if I am more likable and if I care about them and seek to build meaningful relationships. I don't want to be like a person who was filling out a job application. Listen to this guy. Listen to the following statements this guy put on a job application. It's best for employers if I don't work with people. The company made me a scapegoat, just like all of my previous employers. Note, please don't misconstrue my 14 jobs as job hopping. I have never quit a job. References, none. I have left a path of destruction behind me. I don't want to be like that guy, and I'm sure that you don't either. We got to build meaningful relationships. Let me tell you about a book. It's a book by Steve Saccone. It's called Relational Intelligence. It's probably a takeoff from the book back in the 90s by Daniel Goleman on emotional intelligence. Emotional intelligence is really the capacity to have an awareness of yourself, your talents, abilities, strengths, blind spots, as well as how others perceive you. I think Steve's book is a takeoff on that, and I highly recommend the book, both of those books to you, Relational Connections. But in the book, Relational Intelligence, Steve identifies, and I want to share these with you, what he calls the top 10 relational sins. The top 10 relational sins. I mean, these are connection killers. These are things that each of us must avoid if we want to have impact and be a leader that's worth following. Let me share with them, beginning with number 10 and all the way down to number 1. Okay, number 10. These are, remember now, relationship killers. Don't assume your way is always best. That usually means it's not. Number 9. Don't give unsolicited advice. People prefer to trust you first. They're funny that way. Number 8, see how long you can go in a conversation without promoting yourself. Harder than you think. Number 7, don't state the obvious just because you don't have anything profound to say. Sometimes silence is golden. Number 6, don't be bossy. Remember kindergarten when they taught you no one likes a know-it-all. Number 5, stop avoiding conflict, but don't create it either. Number 4, relationship connection killer. Don't self-deprecate. Don't self-deprecate for appearance sake. That's what your spouse and best friends are for. You don't do it. Number 3, don't talk more than you do. Actions always speak louder than words. Number 2, fight the temptation to one-up someone with a better story than theirs. It's hard to believe, but sometimes people do have better stories than ours. And number 1, don't appear more engaged than you actually are. Most people know you're faking it. Most people know you're faking it. So, those are relationship killers. Those are connection killers. What I want to do, and we're going to begin today, I want to look at building meaningful relationships and connections. I want to give you 10 suggestions, things that I have observed in watching people who are worth following and looking at the relationships and connections that I have with people. I want to give you 10 tips or suggestions on how to build more meaningful relationships. We won't get through all of them today, and we'll pick up next time in our next session with part 2 in our time together. So let me begin. All right, number one. And you know, before that, let me mention this. It just came to my mind. Too much of what you and I do in relationships is what I call transactional as opposed to really being relational. In other words, a lot of times the only interest we have in being with someone else is because they can do something for us. It's always about the deal. It's always about the contract. It's always about kind of that hidden agenda is, well, I can do something for you and you can do something for me. That's such a horrible way to work and to live our lives, especially as Christians. It's so short-term and it's so shallow. Our lives don't need to be transactional. They need to be relational where we can really deeply connect with others. And I know this is hard for some folks. I've admitted that it's hard for me. I think it's especially hard for some men. But we've got to build deeper, more meaningful relationships and connections with people if they're going to let us into their lives so we can add value to who they are and to what they do in life. So let's look at these 10 tips. We'll get started, like I said, and we'll finish them up in our next session. Tip number 1, be comfortable with who you are. Be comfortable with who you are. Are you at ease in your own skin? Do you like you? Are you a likable person to yourself? You remember in that greatest commandment, Jesus said, love the Lord your God with all your heart, mind, soul, and strength, and then to love your neighbor. What were those last few words? As yourself. It's really hard. It's really hard to invest and to connect and to build meaningful relationship with others if you're not comfortable with you. It's hard to give yourself away if you don't feel like you have anything to give away when it comes to who you are. So you've got to, first of all, be really, really comfortable with yourself, because how we see ourselves dramatically affects and impacts how we relate and how we connect with others. We've got to love ourselves first so we can better connect with others. This first one seems so obvious, but it's something so often overlooked, and sometimes it's the barrier of why we can't really more deeply connect with people, because somehow I just think they sense that this guy, this gal, they're not even comfortable in their own skin. They're always trying to impress. They're always talking, always promoting themselves. And this first suggestion is so critical. Here are a couple of questions that you could ask that might help you in determining where you are in terms of being comfortable with who you are. Ask yourself this question: How do I want others to experience me? How do I want others to experience me? In other words, think back over your last recent conversations where they were just brief encounters or lunch with somebody and what have you. Look back on those encounters and ask yourself this question. When I walked away, when I left that experience, how do I think they experienced me? Would you be happy? Would you be contented with that answer? And then there's a second question. And this is a great, great question to ask others, especially people that you know, love, and trust, and you think will give you honest feedback, and that's this. What's it like being on the other side of me? What's it like? Tell me. Now, I'm going to tell you, it may be hard to find someone who will be totally objective and honest with you because it is a little bit risky in terms of the relationship. But invaluable information if you can find a handful of people who will give you honest input and the answer to that question, what's it like being on the other side of me? So this first tip in building meaningful connections and relationships is that you be comfortable with who you are. Number two, unconditionally love those that you are privileged to influence. I mean, going into the relationship, okay? Don't judge, don't be critical, don't be negative. I mean, going into any relationship, already make the decision, I'm going to unconditionally love this person no matter what. So you got to, first of all, care for them. Care for them as people. I mean, look at it in working relationships. We don't want to ever use people, friendships. We don't want to ever use people for personal advantage and gain. We don't ever want to do that. We've got to care for them first and foremost as human beings created in the image of God, whether they know Christ personally or not. And we have got to love them unconditionally for who they are and for what they bring to the table. And you do that by getting to know them, by finding out what's important to them, by investing in their lives, by adding value in their lives, helping them to achieve success in their life, even as they define it. Anything that you and I can do to show unconditional love toward them is critical for us to do that. One of my favorite writers and authors is Chuck Swindoll. And Chuck, I came across some years ago what he called the ABCDs, and there's really an A, of building meaningful relationships. And it's a good point to share this with you. A, I accept you as you are. B, I believe you are valuable. C, I care when you hurt. D, I desire your best. And E, I erase all wrongs. Boy, that's a great formula for building meaningful relationships. So when you want to impact the lives of people, be careful never to let rules and regulations and laws, never let that be the determinator. It's always about relationships. It's always about making a difference in the lives of others. Now, one more, and then we'll pick up after next week. Number three. Number one is be comfortable with who you are. Number two, unconditionally love those that you are privileged to influence. And then number three, look for every opportunity. Look for every opportunity to use your influence for their good. Look for every chance, every opportunity and chance to use your impact and influence, not for your good, but for their good. Let go of getting your needs and your wants met first. Always be asking. Man, it's a great question. Always be asking. If you don't verbalize it, at least in your mind, how can I help you? What could I do to serve you? Make it your goal to put the needs and the wants even of others before yourself. That's what Scripture teaches us. Invest in them, empower them, help them to do what they do best and enjoy the most. Always in a relationship, provide for them more than they expect. A good rule of thumb is to underpromise and to overdeliver in the relationships. So those are three tips 3 important tips in building meaningful relationships. We'll come back next week and pick up on the last 7 when we finish our time together. And then I'm going to close next week. You don't want to miss the next session. And that's, is there a sequence? Is there a sequence for building better relationships with people? I really do believe there is. And we'll talk about that when we get together in our next session, part 2 on relational connections. Thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.